Hey guys, tonight we go looking for the most notorious outlaws and criminals the Middle Ages ever produced, the pirates and poisoners and self-made villains whose dark reputations somehow outlasted their crimes. Before we set off, if you find a bit of quiet comfort in these long, rambling stories, it would mean a great deal if you tapped the like button and subscribed, though only if you genuinely enjoy the sort of thing I do here. And I'd love to know, down in the comments, where in the world you happen to be listening from and what the hour is where you are. There's something oddly lovely about imagining all these scattered corners of the globe tuning in to the same slow story at once. So instead of telling you what to do with your evening, I'll simply begin, and we can wander back together into a muddier, stranger age. If you think your own career has taken a chaotic path, allow me to introduce Eustace the monk, a man who started out as a Benedictine cleric and finished as a pirate, so exasperating that both England and France spent years trying to be rid of him. He was born around the year 1170 in northern France, and as a young man he entered a monastery, presumably in search of peace, humility, and all those admirable qualities that sound wonderful right up until you actually attempt them. After a stretch of prayer and plain porridge, Eustace concluded that he preferred a livelier line of work. So he left the cloister behind, relieved a few travellers of their belongings, put a torch to a house or two, and announced that God had summoned him toward a venture. Whether God had signed off on this arrangement remains a matter of some doubt. At some point Eustace fell into a bitter quarrel with a nobleman named Renaud de Martin, a feud that climbed from wounded pride to open arson with alarming speed. Having lost his lands in the dispute, Eustace turned to the sea, on the reasonable theory that a man who cannot win on solid ground may as well go and borrow other people's boats. He soon became the single most unpredictable figure on the English Channel. In 1 year he was raiding the French coast in the service of King John of England. Not long after, he was raiding English shipping on behalf of the French crown. In practice, Eustace was a one-man diplomatic incident, loyal chiefly to whoever was paying that season. Chroniclers described him as a master of disguise, able to melt away as if into thin air, which most likely meant he had a talent for slipping off through the fog before anyone thought to give chase. He also claimed to have studied black magic, which in that era was roughly medieval shorthand for a man who could lie with a very straight face. He was said to summon storms and bend the wind to his will, though in all likelihood he simply waited for foul weather to roll in, and then took the credit for it. In the year 1217, at the Battle of Sandwich, Eustace's long run of luck finally deserted him, and an English fleet under Hubert de Burgh caught him aboard his ship. By then he had earned a fitting byname, the Black Monk, and a medieval poem would later spin his exploits into something close to legend. He offered to buy his freedom with a ransom, which was almost charming given how much he had already carried off over the years. The English declined the offer, and his story ended there on the deck. To the French, he was a patriotic scoundrel. To the English, a demonic nuisance. To everyone in between, he stood as proof that walking out of a monastery is not always the beginning of personal growth. Sometimes it is merely the opening chapter of a rather long crime spree. In 14th century Ireland, celebrities were thin on the ground, but the country did produce Alice Keiteler, who managed to become famous, wealthy, and accused of witchcraft all before her fourth husband quietly died. Some people leave behind a legacy of good works. Alice left behind a trail of buried spouses and unanswered questions. She had been born into money and married into rather more of it. And she seems to have grasped early that being a medieval woman with a sharp and capable mind was quite enough to draw suspicious glances. But once all 4 of her husbands had died under what polite society delicately called peculiar circumstances, that low murmur of suspicion swelled into something closer to hysteria. The town of Kilkenny could not decide whether she was a serial widow with catastrophically bad luck or a witch with unusually good aim. According to the formal charges laid against her, Alice kept a personal demon named Robin Artisan, who was said to appear sometimes as a black dog, sometimes as a shadowy figure of a man, and possibly, when needed, as a very convenient excuse. She was accused of poisoning her husbands with powders, ointments, and unholy herbs, a description that certainly sounds like sorcery, though it could just as easily describe the ordinary medicine of the day. Witnesses swore that she sacrificed animals, chanted Latin backwards, and hosted secret gatherings with her coven, which is to say she was accused of doing more or less what half of Kilkenny got up to on any given weekend, only with far better publicity. The local bishop, Richard de Ledred, launched a righteous campaign against her, because nothing quite announces a holy man like the relentless pursuit of a woman who happens to be rich. Alice, being clever, slipped away to England before anyone could gather a torch. Her servant, Petronilla de Metz, was not so fortunate. She was punished with terrible severity and put to death, becoming the first person recorded as burned for witchcraft in Ireland, and a grim reminder that medieval equality had a very firm and very low ceiling. After that, Alice simply vanished from the record and was never reliably seen again. Some say she lived out her days quietly in England, others claim she made her way to Flanders. And one persistent theory holds that she married yet again, which, if true, suggests she possessed either extraordinary confidence or an unstoppable habit. Whether she was truly guilty hardly matters now. In medieval Europe, wealth, independence, and an above-average survival rate were already treated as forms of witchcraft. Alice Keiteler's real offence was never sorcery. It was outmanoeuvring the whole system long enough to escape it, and in the Middle Ages, that alone came very close to supernatural. If you have ever wanted proof that medieval nobility could be a dangerous blend of power and untreated turmoil, look no further than Gilles de Rais, once the wealthiest war hero in France, and later something far darker. Born in 1405, Gilles had everything the age admired in a man: noble blood, a genuine gift for warfare, and a castle grand enough to need its own district. He was so admired, in fact, that he was named a Marshal of France, among the very highest honours the kingdom could bestow. He fought alongside Joan of Arc, the young visionary who moved hardened soldiers to tears and made the English seriously reconsider their plans. Gilles was her loyal companion in arms, brave and devout. But after Joan's execution, something in him seemed to give way. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps guilt, perhaps a long-suppressed appetite for chaos finally finding its opening. He withdrew from war, built a private theatre inside his castle, and began staging elaborate productions crowded with angels, demons, and himself cast in every leading role. From there, his fortune slid downward, and the slide grew steep. Gilles surrounded himself with alchemists, astrologers, and assorted men who promised him riches in exchange for a short list of ingredients. Disturbing rumours began to spread through the surrounding villages that children were disappearing, hundreds of them, according to the court records that survive. Witnesses spoke of strange rituals, of candles and chanting, and of Gilles falling into a rage whenever the promised gold stubbornly failed to appear. When the church at last turned its attention to him, Gilles was arrested and questioned, though it must be said that questioning in the 15th century leaned rather heavily on pressure and pain. He confessed to everything laid before him. Historians still argue over how much of that confession reflected genuine crimes and how much was drawn out under duress, but even by the standards of his own century, his name was beyond saving. In the year 1440, he was condemned and put to death. Some later called him France's first serial killer. Others insisted he was a convenient scapegoat for a corrupt and jealous nobility. Either way, a man does not travel from fighting beside a saint to the very top of the church's list of the damned without earning the trip. His castles crumbled, his name was scrubbed away, and only his dark legend lingered on. Long before Robin Hood was robbing the rich and dispensing questionable lessons in economics, there was Hereward the Wake, England's original outlaw hero. Unlike Robin, though, Hereward was not charming, not generous, and not remotely polite. He was simply furious, and honestly, it is hard to blame him. Born around 1035, Hereward was a Saxon noble who took a very dim view of William the Conqueror's plan to invade England and replace nearly everyone in it. When the Normans arrived in 1066, most Saxons submitted and learned to keep their heads down. Hereward looked at the new foreign lords, looked at his confiscated lands, and decided that quiet resentment simply would not do. He gathered a band of fellow exiles and declared war on more or less anyone with a French accent. From the marshy country around the Isle of Ely, he led raids against Norman garrisons, harried villages, ambushed knights on lonely roads, and occasionally relieved a monastery of its treasures while calling it divine redistribution. His nickname, the Wake, most likely meant the Watchful One, though it could just as easily have described the trail of disruption he left in his wake. Chroniclers went back and forth between hailing him as a patriotic freedom fighter and denouncing him as a dangerous menace, and in truth, both descriptions fit. Hereward's finest hour came when the Normans tried to reach Ely by building long causeways across the swamp. He allowed them to advance well out onto the marsh, then set the crossing alight, leaving the knights floundering in the mud and smoke. For a while he seemed unstoppable, the mud-soaked emblem of Anglo-Saxon defiance. But rebellions, much like medieval drainage, rarely ended cleanly. In time, the Normans bought off his allies, overran his stronghold, and forced him into flight. Accounts of his death disagree. Some say he was hunted down, others that he lived out his years quietly, forever planning one final ambush that never came. To the English he became the very symbol of resistance, the man who refused to bow, and to historians he is a reminder that being the last honest Saxon is a noble station, indeed, right up until someone invents gunpowder. Scotland has given the world a great many things, among them whisky, bagpipes, and an unshakable reputation for miserable weather. But somewhere in the damp 15th century, it also supposedly produced Sawney Bean, a figure so unsettling that even the old chroniclers wrote of him in a tone that seemed to hope the tale was not true. As the story goes, Sawney Bean left home after deciding that honest labour was beneath him, a sentiment he shared with a fair number of aristocrats of the period. Together with his equally disreputable wife, he settled in a remote coastal cave, a spot chosen for its isolation and its total absence of witnesses. There, the pair began what can only be called the worst family enterprise in Scottish history, waylaying and preying upon travellers who passed along the lonely roads nearby. Over the years, the story claims, they raised an enormous brood of children and grandchildren, 48 in all, hidden away from daylight and the rest of the world. The clan was said to have lived this way for decades, undetected, as travellers vanished one by one along the coast. Suspicion only gathered once. Entire parties of travellers began to go missing at once. Locals blamed witches, wild animals, and strangers, the usual suspects, until one intended victim managed to escape and led the authorities straight to the cave. Modern historians strongly suspect the whole account is heavily exaggerated, or perhaps invented outright, for the earliest written versions of the tale appear only in printed pamphlets long after the supposed events, which has led many to read it less as history and more as a cautionary story. When the search party finally entered, they found grim evidence enough to confirm every rumour that had circulated for years. The beans were captured and taken to Edinburgh, where King James himself is said to have ordered their execution without ceremony or trial, dressed in Scottish mist. Medieval Scotland, after all, was never especially known for its careful record-keeping. Still, the legend of Sawney Bean endures because few things grip the imagination quite so firmly as the idea of an entire family that chose a cave and a life of shadows over an honest day's work. Whether he truly walked the earth or lived only in the fevered imagination of frightened villagers, Sawney Bean endures as a peculiar sort of lesson. The monster people dreaded was not always the one lurking behind stone walls with a coat of arms above the gate. Sometimes, the old stories insist, he lived far more humbly than that, in a damp hollow beside the cold northern sea. And if the medieval world already seems like a tangle of disorder, consider what happens when you fold something like organized crime into the picture. Not the polished kind with tailored suits and expensive cigars, but a version run by people who smelled faintly of turnips and carried blades reworked from farm tools. This was the world of the Thieves' Guild, the medieval equivalent of professional networking for anyone who found honest labour a little too strenuous. In most medieval cities, crime was not merely tolerated. In its way, it was almost a recognised trade. A man might become a mason, a tanner, a cooper, or, if he happened to possess quick fingers and an agreeable indifference to the commandments, a thief. The craftsmen's guilds had their apprenticeships, their years of training, their solemn codes of conduct, and the thieves, remarkably, arranged themselves along much the same lines. In London, in Paris, in Venice, they gathered into loose brotherhoods where techniques were handed down like treasured family recipes. A pinch of stealth here, a well-timed distraction there, and a swift retreat through the nearest reeking drain. They even observed initiation rituals. New recruits swore their loyalty, memorized secret hand signals, and often practiced cutting purses from stuffed dummies before graduating to the pockets of living, breathing citizens. In Paris, such circles were sometimes known as the coquillards, while across the Channel in England they worked out of grim districts like Southwark, the sort of neighbourhood where, as the joke went, even the rats bolted their doors after dark. The authorities were well aware of them, naturally, but medieval law enforcement was an unreliable thing. Constables often went unpaid, easily corrupted, or simply asleep at their posts. The prisons were so filthy that a fair number of criminals apparently preferred to be caught in winter, if only for the shelter and warmth. In certain towns, officials made quiet arrangements with the thieves, collecting a share of the takings in exchange for looking the other way. Yes, the medieval protection racket was a genuine feature of civic life, not a modern invention at all. Still, one should not imagine the Thieves' Guild as a romantic den of lovable rogues. It was a hard and unsentimental business. Members who disobeyed were punished severely, most famously by the loss of a hand, which was rather cruelly ironic given that the hand was the very instrument of their livelihood. And anyone who betrayed the brotherhood tended to vanish faster than a stray coin on a crowded market day. Yet the guilds flourished all the same. In a society obsessed with rank, bloodline and privilege, they offered the common criminal a curious kind of dignity. Thievery became a craft, and mere survival a profession worthy of respect among its practitioners. The lesson, if there is one, is simple enough. Should you ever find yourself wandering the Middle Ages, keep one hand firmly on your purse, and if a stranger jostles you twice in the same street, take a small measure of pride, for you have just made your contribution to a very old economy. The 18th century was a strange, in-between age, no longer quite medieval, yet still grubby enough to qualify in spirit. And through this murky landscape rode Dick Turpin, England's most celebrated highwayman, a man whose reputation galloped a great deal farther and faster than his horse ever managed. Turpin was born around 1705 into a butcher's family, a steady and respectable trade by any measure. But young Turpin preferred to acquire his meat the quicker way, straight from the herds of other men. He began by stealing cattle, moved on to horses, and eventually concluded that robbing people directly involved far less bookkeeping. So opened his notorious career as a highwayman, essentially a roadside robber with a rather better sense of style. He was hardly working alone. The roads circling London swarmed with ambitious criminals, each one privately convinced he was heaven's own gift to the art of theft. What set Turpin apart was his instinct for presentation. He dressed handsomely, spoke with courtesy, and possessed a certain flair for the dramatic. Victims later reported being robbed with genuine civility, which, in fairness, was rather more politeness than they could expect from the tax collector. In time, the pamphlets and newspapers began to dress him up as a gentleman bandit. Plays were written about his supposed daring, most notably the tale of a single night's ride from London to York, nearly 200 miles, upon his faithful mare Black Bess. It makes for a wonderful story. It is also entirely invented. The real Turpin could scarcely have covered such ground without pausing for a drink, then a robbery, and very probably another drink. Behind the polished myth, the actual man was considerably less charming. He was rough, quick to violence, and not especially loyal to those who rode with him. After one job went badly, he came into conflict with a man who recognized him, then fled north and took up the false name John Palmer, a disguise that might have served him well had he not immediately resumed stealing horses. His undoing came from a letter he wrote to his brother, on which he neglected to pay the postage. The postmaster recognized the handwriting, for Turpin was apparently the only criminal in all of Yorkshire who wrote with the flourish of a poet. He was arrested, tried, and put to death in 1739 before a crowd that had gathered as if for a festival. Ever the performer, he is said to have bowed to the onlookers at the very end, proving that even in his final moment, Dick Turpin never once missed his curtain call. His legend has been buffed to a shine by centuries of bad history and good storytelling. The genuine article was no gentleman at all, merely a thief who happened to look rather elegant on paper. If the phrase "holy warrior" sounds like a contradiction, allow me to introduce Fra Morial, the monk who turned salvation into a side venture and warfare into something like a permanent subscription. Born around 1310 in Provence and known in life as Montreal d'Albano, he joined the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, a religious brotherhood devoted to healing the sick, protecting pilgrims on the road, and, when circumstances demanded, taking up arms against anyone who stood in their way. He swore the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then, like a good many ambitious men in habits, quietly decided that all three were open to negotiation. After some years of pious labour, Morial came to the conclusion that the world beyond the cloister paid considerably better. So he reinvented himself as a condottiero, a mercenary captain in Italy, on the reasoning that nothing quite proclaims one's devotion like renting out one's sword to the highest bidder. 14th century Italy was practically a banquet of conflict, with city-states, popes and minor lords all quarrelling endlessly over whose banners looked grandest. Morial slid neatly into the chaos. He founded the Great Company, a band of professional soldiers so numerous it could have overrun a small kingdom. His two brothers, Bretonnet and Arimbaldo, rode with him and kept the books, tallying the ransoms while he tended to the fighting. They fought for whoever paid the most, and on the occasions when nobody paid at all, they fought regardless. They emptied villages, held cities to ransom, and regarded neutrality as little more than a passing inconvenience. At one point, Morreal's forces even turned against the Papal States, which did nothing to improve his standing in the ledgers of heaven. He grew fabulously wealthy, purchasing castles and gold, and, according to one chronicler, a bed befitting a cardinal, along with morals to match. His soldiers admired him, ordinary townsfolk feared him, and the nobility grudgingly conceded that, whatever else could be said, his accounts were always exact. But like so many men who mistake good fortune for divine favour, Morreal pressed his luck too far. By 1354 his greed had estranged nearly everyone, the Pope included. He was seized in Rome and executed by order of the Senate, who, in an uncharacteristic burst of efficiency, saw to the matter before he could talk his way out of it with money. Fra Morreal's story stands as proof that you may remove a man from the monastery, yet the habits of moral bankruptcy prove far harder to leave behind. He departed the world much as he had lived in it, loudly, profitably, and just a little off the page from Scripture. In 15th century France, long before organised crime wore its modern faces, there existed a shadowy fellowship known as the Coquillards, a criminal network sophisticated enough to have delivered a lecture on corruption to eager beginners. They operated chiefly around Dijon in Burgundy, the sort of place where, by local reputation, half the citizens were drinking and the other half were scheming, and nearly everyone was somehow related. These were not simple cut-purses. They were seasoned professionals, confidence men, and gifted impersonators. Wherever there was a coin to lift, a letter to forge, or a trusting nobleman to charm, they had already thought 3 moves ahead. Their very name came from the word for shell, a nod to the scallop shell worn by pilgrims. They liked to pose as devout travellers returning from Santiago de Compostela, murmuring pious phrases while calmly relieving their hosts of anything valuable. In a sense, they were the medieval version of an image without accountability, all appearance and no substance. Among themselves, they spoke a private tongue, a secret argot thick with slang, symbols, and dry wit. This was no mere street chatter, but a genuine subculture. A purse might be called a fish, a knife, a light, and an arrest, a misfortune sent from God's left hand. The purpose was to bewilder everyone except one's accomplices, and it worked splendidly. Even the surviving court records of their trials read like riddles composed by men of questionable habits. Some scholars have long connected the poet François Villon to their circles, since a handful of his ballads survive written in exactly this thieves' jargon, and to this day nobody is entirely certain what all of them mean. The Coquillards specialized in fraud. They peddled counterfeit relics, a thriving trade in a land enchanted by the finger bones of saints, drew up forged documents, and ran travelling swindles in which one man drew a crowd's attention while another lightened their pockets. On quieter days they counterfeited royal seals, a dangerous but rewarding way of turning ordinary parchment into profit. Their downfall arrived when the local authorities finally grasped that an entire town had been outwitted by men in borrowed robes. The Duke of Burgundy launched a determined crackdown and arrested a great many of them. The trials proved oddly theatrical, with some of the accused defending themselves in flawless Latin, which may have startled the court more than the crimes themselves. A few were put to death, others slipped quietly away, and the remainder simply gave the Brotherhood a new name and carried on as before. Though officially stamped out, the coquillards never truly disappeared. They merely evolved into every scam, grift, and elaborate swindle that came afterward, pioneers not of virtue, but of that timeless human dream, wealth without the inconvenience of honest work. If the Mediterranean gave us its glamorous pirates, all earrings and poetry, the Baltic Sea produced the opposite entirely, frost-bitten raiders who smelled of fish and hard luck. These were the Hanseatic pirates remembered as the Vitalian Brooder, or, in plainer English, the Victual Brothers. They were, improbably, named after food supplies, and there is something almost comic in the thought of sailors trembling at the approach of men called the Provisions Brigade. The Brotherhood began, as such things often do, with honourable intentions, which is nearly always a warning sign. Around the late 14th century, the Duke of Mecklenburg hired them to carry victuals to Stockholm, then under siege by the Danes. The pirates performed the task, collected their wages, and then, in the manner of every mercenary sooner or later, discovered that crime was a great deal more entertaining than employment. Before long, they gave up delivering supplies and began seizing anything that floated. They plundered merchant vessels, carried off crews, and held coastal towns to ransom. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of trading cities that ran much of northern Europe, rather like a great corporation, tried repeatedly to stop them and found the pirates simply too capable at their trade. Their motto, so the story goes, was that they were friends of God and enemies of all the world, a phrase that would not look out of place on a banner. They did more than rob ships. They unsettled whole economies. Grain prices soared, commerce faltered, and entire cities began quietly paying them for protection. Their stronghold was the island of Gotland, which they fashioned into something close to a pirate republic, complete with taverns, markets for stolen goods, and presumably some of the least appetizing seafood in recorded history. The best remembered of their captains was Klaus Störtebeker, a figure who still turns up in northern German legends centuries on, celebrated in ballads and statues long after the man himself was gone. By the early 15th century they had become a kind of floating disorder, plundering one day and selling their spoils to bishops the next. Even the Teutonic Knights took up the cause against them, with about as much success as one might expect. In the end, the Hanseatic League gathered its fleets, and after a series of naval battles the pirates were broken. Störtebeker was finally taken near Heligoland and brought to Hamburg around 1401. Those who were captured met a public end, less from any burst of moral outrage than from the merchants' sheer exhaustion at filing the same losses over and over. Yet the legend of the sea wolves lived on, cruel, cunning, and, when the pay was right, even faintly patriotic. In the end, they demonstrated the lesson every empire eventually stumbles into. Feed a band of pirates for long enough, and there comes a day when they stop bringing you tribute and decide that you, personally, look like the better meal. It is an old pattern, and it repeats with a kind of tired inevitability across the centuries. If medieval Germany had produced a streaming service, Peter Nyers might have carried his own true crime series, something with a title like Witchcraft, Murder, and a great many poor decisions. Born somewhere in the 16th century, Nyers was a wandering bandit who took the notion of a career criminal to a genuinely unsettling place. He began, as so many did, with the ordinary trades of the roadside, highway robbery, a bit of theft, the occasional scuffle that ended badly. But the competition along the German roads was fierce, and Nyers, in the manner of a restless entrepreneur, decided to specialize. His chosen niche was murder wrapped in the language of black magic, because apparently even medieval crime had a way of chasing a reputation. The pamphlets of the day, always eager to alarm, claimed that Niers had been responsible for more than 500 deaths over his lifetime. Some of them, the stories insisted, tied to supposed rituals of black magic. The figure alone strains belief. A man who truly managed such a number would have needed a staff and a filing system. Yet the fear he inspired was entirely real, whatever the truth of the count. He was said to travel with a bag of grim curiosities, the sort of ingredients that folklore assigned to sorcerers, and the villagers who whispered about him half believed he could change his shape, slipping into the form of an animal to escape the men who hunted him. It sounds ridiculous to modern ears, until you recall that medieval Europe regarded even ordinary frogs with a certain moral suspicion. Both the church and the local authorities threw considerable effort into catching him, but Niers proved slippery. He had sympathizers scattered across the countryside, innkeepers and beggars and fellow outlaws, whom he kept friendly with a steady flow of stolen goods. To many ordinary peasants he was two things at once, terrifying and quietly admirable, a man who had defied every law of both kings and heaven, and somehow contrived to keep breathing. But crime, like medieval sanitation, tends toward an unpleasant conclusion. He was caught once and escaped, which so embarrassed the authorities that they came down hard on the accomplices they could still lay hands on. He vanished again, then surfaced years later when an innkeeper noticed the peculiar contents of his bag. Word travelled quickly, and within hours the most wanted man in the region was arrested while trying to enjoy a quiet meal. His trial and execution in 1581 were, by the grim customs of the age, a drawn-out public affair, carried out in the manner reserved for the worst offenders. The crowd, it was said, cheered, partly from a sense of justice, and partly because a public execution was, in those days, simply the best entertainment on offer. Whether he was a true dabbler in sorcery, or merely a violent man with a talent for terror, Peter Niers survives as one of medieval Europe's darkest reputations, a figure so feared that both church and state felt they needed every tool at their disposal to be certain he was finished. Every so often, though, the Middle Ages produced a man who looked around at the mud, the hunger, and the endless taxes, and simply decided he had had enough. One such man was Robert of Redesdale, an English rebel who proved that if life hands you feudalism, you can at least refuse to accept the terms quietly. It was the summer of 1469, and England was somewhere in the long middle of the Wars of the Roses, a drawn-out family argument about who would sit on the throne and mismanage the kingdom next. While the nobles slaughtered one another in beautifully decorated armour, the peasants were left broke, hungry, and never more than one bad harvest away from open revolt. Historians cannot quite agree on who Robert really was. Some suggest a disgruntled knight, others a common soldier, and one chronicler settled for describing him as an angry man with influence, a phrase that could just as easily have covered half of medieval England. Whatever his origins, he gathered thousands of peasants, farmers, and minor gentry beneath his banner, and he did it not with lofty promises of liberty, but with something far more immediate, the chance to settle accounts with the people who had been overcharging them for bread. The rebellion swept through northern England like an unwelcome rumour. Manor houses were raided, officials were hauled out of their homes for what amounted to a very public reckoning, and Robert's ragged army began to march south, chanting slogans about reform, though a fair number of them probably just wanted a hot meal and a single glimpse of London. For a while, it worked. Local lords panicked, and the royal court grew nervous. Then, as always seemed to happen with medieval rebellions, reality arrived in the shape of a professional army that found peasant enthusiasm distinctly unintimidating. Robert's forces were scattered within days. The survivors were punished, the villages made to pay, and the writing of history returned to the hands of people who never had to farm. Robert himself simply disappeared, executed or killed, or perhaps melted back into the countryside from which he came. His name lingered afterward, mostly in cautionary tales about the dangers of letting the common folk think too freely. Yet his rising left a real mark. It showed that even within the rigid, supposedly heaven-ordained order of medieval England, there was a limit to how much any one man or any one village could be pushed. Robert did not win, but he reminded the powerful of an uncomfortable truth, that a pitchfork in the right hands counts as a weapon too. Long before spy novels and organized crime and the fashionable anti-heroes of modern drama, there were the assassins of Alamotte, a group so secretive and so unnerving that their name settled permanently into human language. Today the word assassin simply means a killer. In their own time it meant something more particular, a people who could rob a king of a peaceful night's rest for the rest of his life. The story begins in 11th century Persia, where a brilliant and famously stubborn man named Hassan I Sabbah concluded that the Muslim world needed more discipline, more order, and considerably fewer people who disagreed with him. He founded a breakaway movement among the Nizari Ismailis and seized a fortress in the mountains of northern Iran called Alamotte, a stone eagle's nest perched high above the valleys. From there he built one of the most feared secret societies in all of history. Their enemies called them the Hashashin, spreading the story that they took hashish before their missions, a slander most likely invented by people who resented being outmaneuvered. In truth, the assassins were not wild-eyed fanatics, but professionals, quiet, educated, and endlessly patient. Their specialty was political murder, carried out with such precision that entire campaigns could change direction after a single act. They slipped into palaces disguised as servants, scribes, or unremarkable gardeners, waited for the right moment, and then struck cleanly, often in full view of an audience, so that the message could not be missed. Kings, generals, caliphs, and even the Crusader lords learned to check their food, their wine, and their bedchambers more than once. A few grew paranoid enough to sleep in towers ringed with guards, which worked beautifully right up until someone thought to bribe the guards. They never commanded large armies, and they never needed to, because fear did the greater part of their work. One well-placed act could halt an invasion, rewrite a treaty, or persuade a proud ruler to rediscover the virtue of humility. Even the mighty Saladin, the conqueror of Jerusalem, is said to have come close to their list of targets more than once. In the end, their fortress fell to the Mongols in the 13th century because very little survived a Mongol arrival, not cities, not walls, not even a secret mountain order. The word assassin travelled west with the returning Crusaders and worked its way into nearly every language on earth. And though the men of Alamotte vanished long ago, the lesson they left behind proved oddly durable, that the sharpest argument in politics can sometimes be a very small and very... But the legend refused to die. Well-placed blade. If you lived in medieval London and still had your money when the sun went down, you had, in a sense, won the day. You had beaten the city's most popular unofficial sport, which was simply not getting robbed. Long before bankers invented more elaborate methods of parting people from their coin, there were the cut purses, the silent professionals who elevated pickpocketing to something close to an art form. London in those centuries was crowded, chaotic, and thick with humanity. Its narrow streets were packed with markets, pilgrims, tradesmen, and the occasional wandering goat, and this dense confusion made a perfect habitat for petty crime. While preachers thundered about sin, the cut purses quietly relieved the faithful of their offering coins. They did not mug, and they did not brawl. That was the work of amateurs. A skilled cutpurse was a craftsman. The blade had to be sharp, the hand steady, and the timing flawless. The name describes the method exactly, for these thieves cut the strings of the pouch that hung from a belt, and with a single quiet slice the purse would disappear into the crowd. Some worked alone, others in teams, one man delivering a well-timed bump, while another distracted the mark with a sudden burst of piety. By the time the victim had finished saying Amen, a week's wages had wandered off. Apprentices learned the trade much as blacksmiths and bakers did, training under a master and practicing on dummies, or, more often, on cheerful drunkards. Success called for a calm temperament and a conveniently quiet conscience. Medieval law punished theft severely, yet public hangings were so common that thieves treated them almost as networking events, and when a mentor met his end, his customers were quietly inherited. Nor was it only men at the trade. London's female cutpurses were legends in their own right, often posing as flower sellers, laundry girls, or repentant sinners. One woman, remembered as Nan Hackett, is said to have worked the church aisles during Mass, specialising in noble women who kept their eyes closed a little too long in prayer. The authorities knew perfectly well what was happening and were frequently in on it, since sheriffs, judges, and guards all expected their share. For every thief on the gallows, several more were plying the trade in the crowd gathered below to watch. In time, the word cutpurse became a general insult, a way to describe anyone of flexible morals, and honestly, not so very much has changed. Modern London has fewer pouches and more pockets, but the spirit of the old cutpurse endures, usually now behind a screen or a service counter. And when you hear the name Vlad the Impaler, your mind probably reaches first for the vampire, all brooding castles and circling bats and a taste for the dramatic. The truth is a good deal plainer. Vlad did not drink blood, he simply dealt in death on an industrial scale and with an unsettling degree of bureaucratic consistency. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad of Wallachia inherited a small principality wedged between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary, two neighbours who tended to treat Wallachia less as a nation than as a thing to chew on. His father, Vlad Dracul, had joined a knightly society called the Order of the Dragon, which sounds grand but functioned rather like a club for men with swords and grievances. The younger Vlad inherited the name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, and took the inheritance rather more seriously than anyone intended. As a young prince, he spent years as a political hostage among the Ottomans, where he absorbed lessons in diplomacy and military strategy, along with a deep and lasting distrust of nearly everyone. When he finally reclaimed his throne in 1456, he set about solving his country's crime problem by making the punishments considerably more frightening than the crimes. His chosen method was impalement, an execution by stake that became inseparable from his name, and he applied it with a cold impartiality to thieves, liars, foreign envoys, and even guests who forgot their manners. When the Ottomans invaded, he is said to have arranged a vast and grim display of prisoners outside his capital, some 20,000 of them, as a warning to the advancing army. The invaders, the story goes, took one look and turned around. It is hard to blame them. To his own subjects he was at once protector and terror. Crime all but vanished, partly out of fear, and partly because so much of the troublesome population had been made an example of. Merchants, it was claimed, could leave gold in the open overnight and find it untouched by morning. In the end, Vlad was captured by the Hungarians, released, and eventually killed in battle, and his head was reportedly sent to the Sultan preserved in honey, because even the villains of that age appreciated a certain sense of presentation. Centuries afterward, Bram Stoker borrowed the name and made him immortal as Count Dracula, granting him a far tidier form of eternal life than anything he had known while alive. Still, the truth outlasts the legends. Vlad the Impaler was never quite the storybook monster later centuries made of him. He was something stranger and, in its way, rarer. A ruler so devoted to order and to the letter of his own harsh law that he turned punishment into a kind of grim public policy. His cruelty was real, but it was cruelty with a ledger behind it, a man convinced that fear was simply the cheapest form of government. And with that thought we leave the mountains of Wallachia behind and travel far back in time and far to the east to a hotter city and an older empire where another figure who bent the world to his will was about to meet the one enemy he could not out. Babylon, in the month of June, in the year 323 before the Common Era. The air hangs heavy with heat, thick with the scent of roasted meat, drifting incense, and something harder to name that might simply be ambition. At the head of a long marble table sits Alexander the Great, the man who had crossed deserts, stormed walled cities, and folded whole kingdoms into his own. Around him his generals laugh a little too loudly and drink a little too freely, their good cheer stretched thin over exhaustion and a fear none of them will say aloud. The feast is hosted by Medius of Larissa, one of his closest companions, and the wine has passed from hand to hand since the afternoon. The banquet is meant to celebrate a bold new plan, a campaign south into Arabia, its fleets already being built along the river. Yet it carries the mood of a man daring fate to look his way one last time. He is 32 years old and has never lost a battle. Even so, his body wears the cost of all that conquering. Old scars trace pale lines across his arms like faint lightning. His voice has grown hoarse, his eyes reddened by weeks of little sleep and too much wine. But he is still Alexander, and in Babylon that means no one turns away when he lifts his cup. Another toast he calls, and the room obeys at once. He drinks deeply, wine cut with water and honey and perhaps something more. The cup knocks back against the table. For a heartbeat his face tightens. He laughs it off. The king who once strode through the palaces of Persia now needs a moment to steady himself as he rises from his own chair. Some would later say it began right there, a sudden pain, a heat in his belly that refused to cool. Others insisted a fever had already taken hold days earlier, caught while he inspected the canals near the Euphrates. But within his inner circle, quieter suspicions began to spread like fine cracks through marble. Cassander, the son of Antipater, had reasons of his own to wish the king gone. Other men had been humiliated, set aside, or frightened by Alexander's growing insistence that he be honoured as a living god, a demand that strained loyalties already worn thin. That night the musicians played louder, as if to drown the tension. The wine flowed as freely as the great river beyond the city gates. The torches burned low, washing the marble walls in unsteady gold. And somewhere between the laughter and the haze, the conqueror of the known world began, very slightly, to shiver. No one dared name it yet, but something had begun that could not be undone. The man who had never lost a battle may have just entered a struggle his sword could not settle, one that started with a single cup raised in Babylon. The morning after the feast, the city woke beneath a punishing sun. Through the palace, servants murmured the news to one another. The king has fallen ill. At first it seemed a small thing. Alexander had endured far worse. He had survived arrow wounds and lung sickness and the sort of exhaustion that quietly kills ordinary men. A touch of fever was nothing, or so they told themselves. He woke soaked in sweat, his whole frame trembling as though the empire inside him were shaking loose. When attendants brought him wine, he waved it away, saying it burned his throat. His generals came to see him, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and Nearchus among them, men who had marched with him across deserts and through years of hard campaigning. They found him pale and thin, voiced, and still, remarkably, asking for military reports. Even half wandering in fever, he spoke of troop formations and the building of fleets, as if death were merely one more city waiting to be besieged. But the fever climbed. Within hours, he could no longer rise from the bed. His commanders whispered in the corridors, masking their worry with politics. Was it malaria drawn up from the marshes near the Euphrates? Typhoid carried in tainted water? Or something less natural, something slipped into the mixing bowl by a nervous hand the night before? Babylon was full of suspects, and fuller still of fear. The days passed, and the fever deepened. His breathing grew ragged, his speech began to slur. The same man who had once run beside his soldiers, shouting commands with perfect clarity, now struggled to shape a single word. The royal physicians were called in, and their hands shook as they pressed cool cloths to his brow. Some urged purging, others prayer. None would admit that they were powerless. Even then, Alexander refused to believe his own body had turned against him. "I will recover," he rasped, as though speaking it might make it so. He asked for his armor. He demanded to see his soldiers. He could not so much as lift his head. Each day the rumor traveled a little further. Inside his chamber, the greatest conqueror Babylon had ever hosted lay burning with fever, still murmuring plans to invade Arabia even as his strength drained away. The man who had faced whole armies without flinching now faced a final, unseen opponent, one that no spear could reach and no clever strategy could outwit. By the fifth day, the royal palace felt less like the heart of an empire and more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The once crowded halls had gone strangely quiet. Servants moved without a sound, guards spoke in whispers, and courtiers traded glances weighed down with dread. The doctors came and went like ghosts, their eyes sliding away from the generals. They had run out of explanations, and perhaps out of courage as well. The fever had not broken. Alexander's skin held a sickly sheen, and his breath came shallow, each gasp a small act of defiance against whatever had taken hold of him. His commanders, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Perdiccas, gathered in the antechamber, pretending to discuss supply lines and logistics. In truth, they had already begun to circle an impossible question: who rules the world when Alexander no longer can? No one said it aloud. But ambition had begun to stir beneath the sorrow. Babylon hummed with quiet unease. Every man in that chamber had, at least once, imagined the crown on his own head or a province of the empire in his own hands. The longer the king lingered between living and dying, the more dangerous the silence became. His voice, once loud enough to command thousands, had shrunk to a whisper. "Will I recover?" he asked the physicians. They bowed and offered assurances they did not believe, then hurried from the room as quickly as they had entered. By evening, the corridors filled with rumor. Some claimed the gods were punishing him for daring to call himself divine. Others whispered darker suspicions, that poison, not sickness, was to blame. Names passed from mouth to mouth like tossed daggers. Antipater, Cassander, Iolaus, even Aristotle, his old teacher, whom some imagined had supplied the fatal recipe from afar. Outside, soldiers knelt before the palace gates and prayed for their king. They had followed him from Macedon to India, across deserts and over mountains, certain he could not be touched. Now, for the first time, they sensed the plain truth of him. He was mortal. That night, Babylon did not sleep. The torches burned low, throwing long shadows across the marble and across frightened men. In the king's chamber, the soft drip of water marked the passing hours. The physicians could do nothing but watch. It is said that some of his closest companions kept vigil through those hours in the temple of Serapis, sleeping on the floor in the old custom, hoping the god might send a dream that told them whether the king should be carried there to be healed. The answer, when it came, was that he was better left where he lay. The stillness of the palace settled deep and complete, as though even the gods were holding their breath. By the seventh day, the fever had turned the chamber into a place of whispers. Alexander lay motionless on a silk-draped bed, while his empire, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, trembled along invisible fault lines. Each day the generals gathered, pretending to seek news of his health, while quietly waging a very different war, the war of succession. Perdiccas, the loyal lieutenant, insisted he was only carrying out the king's last commands, though his eyes betrayed cold calculation. Ptolemy, calm and smiling, hid his ambition behind smooth diplomacy. Seleucus stood apart, watching, as if already measuring how long each of the others might last with no king left to obey. The question gnawed at them all. Who inherits an empire built entirely around one man's will? Alexander had no clear heir. His wife Roxana was with child, but the fate of that child was uncertain. Some suggested Heracles, his son born outside marriage, might be proclaimed king. Others murmured that the generals should simply divide the realm among themselves, an idea that sounded like blasphemy and yet tasted like freedom. Later writers would claim that when the king was pressed on who should follow him, he answered only that it should go to the strongest, a handful of words that would set the whole coming age in motion. Beyond the sick room, the courtyards of Babylon buzzed with tension. The army waited, restless and suspicious. Macedonian veterans, hardened by decades of campaigning, demanded to see their commander and swore they would take orders from no one else. If Alexander died, they muttered, they would choose their own leaders, a promise that chilled the generals to the bone. Inside, the air grew closer by the hour. The physicians proposed rituals to soothe the gods, desperate to appear useful. Priests chanted beside the bed and stirred the heavy incense smoke. Alexander, half conscious, murmured commands to soldiers or to shadows, no one could be sure. Now and then his eyes opened, glazed yet unbowed, and he looked, even then, like a man about to give an order that might reshape the world. By the eighth day, the palace gates could no longer hold back the crowd. Thousands of soldiers, sunburned and scarred and still loyal to the man who had led them from Macedon to the edge of India, pressed outside and demanded to see their king. Rumour had replaced command. Some said he was recovering. Others whispered he was already gone, and that the generals were hiding it to carve up the empire in secret. Inside, the mood had grown almost unbearable. The generals argued in hushed voices that still slipped through the marble. Ptolemy urged calm. Perdiccas warned that the men outside would riot unless they were given proof their king still lived. At last they agreed to let the army pass. One by one the soldiers filed through the great bronze doors. They came barefoot and unarmed, not as warriors but as mourners, a long line winding through the courtyard like a slow river of grief. Within the chamber Alexander lay still, his face nearly as pale as the linen beneath him. He could not speak, he could not move. Yet as the men entered, something remarkable happened. As each soldier knelt beside the bed, Alexander opened his eyes just enough to meet theirs. He lifted his hand a little, trembling but unmistakably alive. A faint smile crossed his lips, half a greeting, half a command. It was enough. The soldiers sank to their knees, some of them weeping openly, whispering his name like a prayer. In their eyes he was still invincible, a figure who merely rested before the next great campaign. To the generals, though, the sight brought no comfort at all. They saw the truth of it. The king who had conquered the world could barely raise his arm. The thing that had held his empire together, his presence, his will, his impossible charisma, was quietly slipping away. When the last soldier had gone, silence returned to the room. Outside, the army chanted his name into the night, never guessing that the small gesture they had just witnessed was his final act of command. Inside, the torches flickered low, and Babylon held its breath as the long vigil ended and the waiting began. By the 10th day, the heat lying over Babylon has begun to feel wrong somehow, as though the world itself has caught the same illness. Inside the palace, the air hangs heavy with incense and quiet dread. The greatest conqueror the world has known lies almost motionless, his chest lifting only faintly with each shallow breath. Around him his generals, his physicians, and his servants keep watch in silence, each one pretending not to be measuring how much longer the frail rhythm can last. Alexander's eyes, once so bright, are half closed now, the gaze behind them clouded and far away. His lips move around words that no one in the room can quite catch. The physicians moisten his mouth with a little water and honey, but he has stopped swallowing. The long fever has worn him down to almost nothing, leaving only the shadow of the man who once shouted commands over the din of 1,000 spears. The generals edge closer, sensing the end is near yet unwilling to name it aloud. Ptolemy stands with his arms folded, his face carved from stone. Perdiccas paces the chamber like a restless wolf shut in a pen. Seleucus watches without a word, already turning borders and boundaries over in his mind. A few of the others murmur prayers to Apollo, to Asclepius, even to Zeus, appealing to any god who might take pity on a man who had once believed himself one of them. Then, at last, the hush is broken. Alexander asks for his soldiers. His voice is little more than a dry whisper, but they understand it. Word carries through the palace, and before long the courtyard fills once more. One by one, the veterans who had followed him across continents file into the room. Some press his hand to their lips, others simply bow, too overcome to speak. He lifts his hand faintly toward his generals, a final gesture of unity, or perhaps a last command that no one can be certain of. Someone bends close and asks him who should rule when he is gone. His eyes drift. His breathing slows further. The answer comes out so faint it is nearly lost in the air. To the strongest, he seems to say. A moment later, the hand that had once held the fates of nations grows still. The torches gutter, as if some unseen breath had passed across them. Outside, the soldiers who had been chanting fall quiet all at once, sensing the truth before anyone comes to tell them. For a single heartbeat, all of Babylon holds still. No war cries, no footfalls, no sound at all, only the weight of a death too vast for one room to hold. The conqueror of the world has drawn his last breath, and for a moment the world itself seems uncertain how to go on without him. When the news does move, it does not travel so much as erupt. Babylon breaks open in grief and disbelief. Soldiers tear at their tunics, women cry out from the rooftops, and priests hurry to the temples to offer sacrifices that suddenly feel hollow. The greatest man alive, the living God, is gone, and the empire he had stitched together, that improbable quilt of peoples and loyalties, trembles like a statue that has begun to crack. Inside the palace, chaos replaces ceremony. The generals argue in whispers that swell louder by the hour. Who speaks for the king now? Perdiccas demands they wait and follow the proper rites. Ptolemy insists that the treasury be secured at once before opportunists catch the scent of weakness. Others speak of carrying Alexander's body home to Macedon, and even that suggestion sparks a quarrel. Babylon has become a war council dressed in the clothes of mourning. Beyond the walls, thousands of soldiers kneel in the dust, and many simply refuse to believe. He cannot die, one of them mutters. He is Alexander. To these men he was never merely a person, but an idea, and ideas do not die of a fever. They plead to see the body, to touch him, to prove for themselves that their god-king still breathes. When the gates at last swing open, the procession moves like a slow storm. Torchlight fills the courtyard as the soldiers enter, silent but shaking. The body rests upon a raised bier, draped in royal silk, the faint scent of embalming oil already threading the air. His armour gleams beside him, the same bronze cuirass that had caught the sun at Gaugamela. Some of the veterans sink to their knees and press their fists against the stone. Others repeat his name over and over, as though the sound alone might undo what has happened. Even the elephants kept in the royal stables trumpet mournfully, unsettled by the wave of grief moving through the city. That night Babylon does not sleep. Fires burn along the walls, 1,000 small suns flickering against the dark of the desert sky. The markets stand silent, the taverns empty. Every home glows with lamplight, and every face is turned toward the palace. For 12 years the name Alexander had meant victory, destiny, the favour of heaven. Now it carries something heavier. It means loss. And in the echoing streets of Babylon, a single quiet truth settles over everything, like dust drifting down after a battle. No one rules the world forever. Not even Alexander. His death did not end Alexander's wars. It only moved them to a new field. Within days of his passing, the marble halls of Babylon became a chessboard of ambition. The generals who had once raised cups to his triumphs now schemed in the very rooms where his body lay, preserved in honey and myrrh. That corpse, strangely lifelike and radiant, became the most sought-after relic on earth, the symbol of authority itself. Whoever holds it, some whispered, holds the right to rule. Perdiccas, as commander of the royal army, took charge of the arrangements and declared that Alexander must be returned to Macedonia to lie beside his father, Philip II. The others nodded politely while quietly planning to steal him. Ptolemy, the shrewd Macedonian who had been stationed in Egypt, had other designs. He believed the body belonged in a new capital, his own capital, Alexandria. A dead god, after all, makes an excellent foundation for a living city. The golden funeral carriage they built was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A rolling temple crowned with statues and columns, and a gilded canopy that glittered under the sun. It would take months to reach Macedon, and everyone understood how many chances there would be along the way for it to change course. As the procession departed Babylon, thousands of soldiers marched alongside it in tears and silence. But behind them, the empire they had bled for was already beginning to come apart. Rival factions armed themselves. Secret letters passed from hand to hand. Men prepared to make certain that one man's funeral became another man's coronation. True to form, Ptolemy struck first. As the procession crossed Syria, his forces intercepted it, and the escort, seeing themselves outnumbered, gave up the carriage without a fight. Alexander's body was carried off to Egypt, not to Macedon, not to the homeland, but to the sands of the Nile. When the news reached Babylon, outrage mixed with a weary resignation. Some called it theft, others called it destiny. Alexander had always admired Egypt, and had even been proclaimed there the son of Zeus Ammon. Perhaps, some reasoned, he had wished to rest where he had been worshipped as divine. For his former generals, though, the seizure was no holy act. It was a declaration of war. The age of Alexander ended not in peace or mourning, but in a scramble for his ghost. The man who had bound the world together in life now divided it in death. In the months that followed, his empire shattered like glass dropped from Olympus. The unity he had forced into being through sheer force of will and personality collapsed under the ordinary weight of human greed. His generals, once held together by his brilliance, now cut the world into kingdoms of their own. They called themselves the Diadochi, the successors, but each behaved like a scavenger circling a divine feast. Perdiccas claimed to rule as regent for the unborn son of Roxana, another Alexander yet to be born, but the others refused to acknowledge him. Ptolemy held Egypt and guarded the stolen body as a sacred treasure. Antigonus took Asia. Seleucus set his eyes on Babylon, and Cassander seized Greece. The realm of one man splintered into rival kingdoms, every one of them thick with ambition and betrayal. All the while, Alexander's corpse grew more powerful than any living king. Ptolemy first placed it at Memphis, then later moved it to a marble tomb in Alexandria, where pilgrims lined up to look upon the man who had called himself the son of Zeus. Over the years that tomb became a shrine, then a political symbol, and finally a mystery, for its exact location slipped out of the records altogether, as if even in death he refused to be pinned to one place. Some said Alexander had never truly died at all, but had ascended to the gods who had fathered him. Others claimed his body would not decay, taking it as proof of heaven's favour. Poets sang of his deeds and painted him as conqueror and saint, tyrant and visionary all at once. To the Greeks he was Achilles born again, to the Persians he was a cursed destroyer, to the generations that came after he became a myth that would not fade. His soldiers, scattered now across continents, carried his legend home with them. They told of a man who had dreamed larger than the earth itself, who crossed deserts as though chasing the horizon, who was said to have wept because there were no worlds left for him to conquer. In their memories, the fever that took him softened into something poetic, a punishment sent by jealous gods rather than a simple sickness. By the time centuries had passed, no two people agreed on how he had died, only that he had changed the course of everything. Kings would borrow his name, generals would chase his shadow, and cities would rise upon the ruins he left behind. Alexander the Great had fallen in Babylon, but the myth he made, brilliant and unrelenting and immortal, never truly stopped marching. The year is 48 BCE. Egypt is divided now, not by foreign invaders, but by its own royal family. Cleopatra VII, the last daughter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, finds herself driven out of Alexandria by her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIII. The court has turned against her, a nest of scheming eunuchs and tutors who murmur poison into the boy king's ear. Cleopatra flees into the desert with only a small band of loyal followers, trading the marble halls of the palace for a tent beneath the wide and endless Egyptian sky. Meanwhile, far to the west, Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria, not as a suitor, but as a man of Roman law. He has been pursuing Pompey, his rival and former ally, who had fled to Egypt hoping to find safety there. But when Caesar steps onto Egyptian soil, he learns that Pompey has already been killed, and that the boy king's courtiers had done the deed and presented the proof to Rome, thinking it would win his favour. Caesar is not pleased. The gesture strikes him as both brutal and politically foolish. It is in this uncertain moment that Cleopatra makes her move. She understands that Egypt's throne is not won with armies, but with opportunity, and so, wrapped in a carpet or a linen sack, depending on which historian you trust, she has herself smuggled into Caesar's private chambers within the royal palace. When the rug is unrolled, the conqueror of Gaul finds no assassin waiting, but a 21-year-old queen, travel-worn yet glowing with confidence. Cleopatra speaks 7 languages. Caesar speaks the language of power. Between the two of them, words become instruments, and admiration a kind of unspoken treaty. She argues her cause not as a helpless exile, but as a ruler wronged by treachery, and Caesar listens, intrigued. He is 52 years old and weary from decades of war. Yet in this Egyptian queen he sees a reflection of his own relentless, clever, fearless ambition. Before long, an alliance is forged, sealed in silk and strategy. Cleopatra gains a protector in the most powerful man in the world, while Caesar gains access to Egypt's vast wealth and its grain, a lifeline for the ever-hungry city of Rome. What began as cold political calculation soon deepens into something far more dangerous, a partnership that will scandalize empires and bend the course of history. Caesar's visit was meant to be a brief diplomatic errand. Instead, it turned into a war zone. The moment he named Cleopatra the rightful ruler, the palace erupted. To the advisors of Ptolemy XIII, especially the scheming eunuchs and the general Achilles, the decision looked like nothing less than foreign interference. To them, Cleopatra was no queen restored. To many in the East, she looked like little more than a Roman puppet, and if the throne of Egypt was to be held at all, then Rome itself would somehow have to be pushed back out the door. And so Alexandria, that shining ornament of the whole Mediterranean world, became a place of siege. The narrow lanes rang with the sound of swords, and dark smoke from burning ships drifted low across the harbour. Caesar found himself hemmed in within the royal quarter, caught between the Egyptian army on one side and, on the other, a restless population that had not long before cheered for their queen. For all his gifts as a commander, Caesar had arrived in Egypt with only about 4,000 soldiers, a slender force for a city of 500,000 souls. Cleopatra stayed close through it all, unhurried amid the disorder. She was never simply a beautiful woman in distress. She was shrewd, she was persuasive, and she understood perfectly well that her own future was bound up with his. Between them, they turned the palace into something like a stronghold. Cleopatra drew on her deep knowledge of the streets and the shifting loyalties of the court to outthink her brother's followers, while Caesar, tactician to the last, ordered the Egyptian fleet set alight so that it could not seal off his line of retreat. That fire, by unlucky accident, spread beyond the docks and reached the great library, where a large store of papyrus scrolls was lost to the flames. The siege wore on for months. Provisions dwindled, spirits sagged, and still Caesar would not withdraw. He sent out urgent appeals for reinforcements, all the while fending off pressure from both land and water. Cleopatra kept his nerves steady, offering him counsel and quiet reassurance in equal measure. Later writers would dress their partnership up in the softest colours of romance, yet the truth is that it was hammered into shape amid the groan of siege engines and the sharp smell of burning pitch. Then, at last, relief came. A Roman column, led by Mithridates of Pergamon, forced its way through the Egyptian lines, and the balance tipped almost at once. The forces of the young king Ptolemy XIII broke and scattered, and the boy ruler himself is said to have drowned in the waters of the Nile, dragged under by the weight of his golden armour. It was a quiet, sorrowful end for a child king, undone less by any enemy than by pride and the tangled politics around him. As the smoke thinned over Alexandria, Cleopatra stood as the one left standing, not merely as Queen of Egypt, but as the woman who had steered a civil war to its close and won over the most powerful general of the age. With her brother gone and Caesar's legions holding the city, she reclaimed at last the throne that had been taken from her. But in Egypt no victory was ever truly settled, least of all for a queen who ruled beneath Rome's steady, watchful gaze. To shore up her right to the crown, Cleopatra observed the old Ptolemaic custom and married her surviving younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, a boy scarcely into his teens. It was a formality, and nothing more. A ceremony performed out of respect for tradition, while the real weight of power sat beside her in the person of Julius Caesar. Alexandria itself changed swiftly, from a city battered by war into a place of ceremony and renewal. Cleopatra held court in her palace by the sea, resplendent in gold and deep blue lapis lazuli, and Caesar remained as her guest, or perhaps her willing prisoner of affection. The two of them ruled side by side, and each public appearance became a carefully arranged picture of harmony between Egypt and Rome. To the people of Alexandria, she was Isis, walking the earth again, luminous and holy. To Caesar, she was living proof that diplomacy could be a seductive art. Her cleverness and charm left even seasoned Roman officers quietly astonished. She could soothe a room full of hardened generals as easily as she could turn to a line of philosophy. Caesar, a man who had spent a lifetime among political games, found in her a match who grasped exactly what was at stake, not merely a lover, but an equal in ambition. At first the alliance was a matter of cold calculation, yet the boundary between strategy and feeling soon grew faint. Then came the news that shifted everything. Cleopatra was expecting a child. The announcement thrilled Alexandria and unsettled Rome in equal measure. Caesar was already a married man, and no Roman law allowed him to wed a foreign monarch. And yet, walking in the palace gardens, Cleopatra carried herself with the calm glow of someone who had already triumphed. The child she bore, later called Caesarion, would stand as a living emblem of their union, a bridge laid down between two empires, or perhaps a spark set quietly beside them both. While the courtiers murmured behind their hands, Cleopatra bent her mind to the future. She strengthened Egypt's finances, reshaped its taxes, and restored temples that had fallen into ruin. To ordinary Egyptians she became a bringer of plenty, a goddess of good harvests. To Caesar she was at once a temptation and a political knot he could not easily untie. Their bond, scandalous enough on its own, had now produced something with real consequences, an heir who might join two worlds together or throw them both into confusion. And for the first time, Caesar began to understand that Cleopatra's affection arrived with an entire kingdom attached to it. In 47 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar at last made ready to return to Rome. The civil war still burned, and Mark Antony, his faithful lieutenant, needed him at home. Yet he did not depart on his own. Cleopatra, now mother to his newborn son Caesarion, went with him for a stretch down the Nile in what became one of the most lavish river journeys ever recorded. The royal barge glittered beneath sails of purple, musicians played along the decks, and attendants moved to the measure of flutes. The voyage was half festival and half proclamation. Egypt had been reborn under its queen, and she now had Rome's champion at her side. For a handful of precious months they drifted together past ancient temples and old tombs, presented to onlookers as a new divine pairing, Caesar in the guise of Dionysus and Cleopatra as Isis. But Rome was never far from his thoughts. He left Egypt with reluctance, promising to send for her before long. Cleopatra, practical as ever, knew well that affection alone would not shield her or her child. She had to tie Egypt's fortunes firmly to Rome's ambition. When Caesar reached the capital, rumour had run ahead of him. In the Senate, men whispered that he had grown soft in Alexandria, that Cleopatra had somehow enchanted him. They sneered at her as the Eastern sorceress and named him her plaything. Caesar paid the talk no mind. He had grander designs, plans to remake Rome into a monarchy under his own single hand. Yet in private he sent for Cleopatra, and against every piece of advice she came, arriving in Rome with her infant son and a following so splendid that even world-weary Romans were left staring. Her coming stirred outrage. No foreign queen had ever been received in the city with such honours. Caesar lodged her in his villa across the Tiber, within plain sight of Rome, almost as though he were inviting the Senate to object. Cleopatra walked the streets with an easy confidence, dressed in gold and fine Egyptian linen, a living rebuke to Roman ideas of modesty. Onlookers gawked, half enthralled and half affronted. For her part, Cleopatra treated Rome as hostile ground closed in marble. She spoke with care, watched everything closely, and won over those who counted, senators, philosophers, even Caesar's own allies. Still, she understood that she was walking along the edge of a blade. Caesar's favour kept her safe for the moment, but envy was already gathering in the cool halls of power. Beneath all the admiration and ceremony, quiet plans were being sharpened. She had conquered Caesar's heart, but Rome was another matter entirely. Her stay in the city felt less like a visit than a grand display, a test of just how far Caesar could bend the Republic before it cracked. Rome had never seen her like. Draped in Egyptian cloth, wearing jewels that caught the Italian sun, she came to public occasions with the poise of a goddess and the assurance of a conqueror. To Roman eyes she was exotic, dangerous, and endlessly fascinating, the very image of a foreign power that had captivated their greatest man. Caesar went so far as to place a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom he claimed his own descent. The message was unmistakable and deeply provocative. Cleopatra was no ordinary guest, but something touched by the divine, perhaps even kin to Rome's own gods. The senators bristled. To them this was not reverence but insult, proof that Caesar had abandoned the old Roman virtue of restraint. Behind the polished admiration lay resentment. The Roman elite muttered that her influence was swelling, that she was urging Caesar to set a crown upon his head, that she dreamed of trading the Republic for an empire directed from Alexandria. Whether a word of it was true scarcely mattered. In Rome, persecution itself was a kind of poison, and her presence supplied it in abundance. Even so, Caesar seemed untroubled. He pressed on with his reforms, reordered the calendar, and sketched out vast new building works. He even renamed a month, July, after himself. And whenever he slipped away to his villa across the Tiber, Cleopatra and their son were there waiting. Caesarion, fair-haired and curious, was proof of a tie that no politics could easily dissolve. Caesar never openly named the boy his heir, yet no one in the city was in any doubt about whose child he was. Cleopatra played her part with great care. She flattered senators, attended festivals, and presented herself as both a queen and a woman of learning. In quieter moments, she watched the slow unravelling of the Republic, a theatre of ambition in which every smile might hide a blade. She understood Rome, in some ways, better than the Romans did. It was a place where love was never only love, and where alliances were often written in blood. When strange signs began to appear, unusual lights in the night sky, warnings dressed as prophecy, Caesar brushed them aside with a laugh. Cleopatra did not. She had seen enough courts crumble to know what fear and envy could do to a powerful man. Rome, she felt, was holding its breath, and not out of admiration. By 44 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar stood at the summit of his power and, at the very same moment, upon a knife's edge. He had been declared dictator in perpetuity, dictator for life, a title that sounded to many senators less like an honor than a curse. Statues of him rose in the forum, his face appeared upon the coinage, and to Romans who still clung to the fading dream of the Republic, it all bordered on sacrilege. In their eyes, Caesar had become the one thing every Roman had been taught to dread, a king. Cleopatra observed the mounting drama from her villa across the Tiber. She noticed the sidelong glances, the tense silences in the Senate, and her instincts, honed through years of palace intrigue, told her what Caesar would not let himself see. Power is never left unchallenged for long. She pressed him toward caution, urged him to trust no one, but Caesar was too sure of himself. He had come safely through battles, mutinies, and would-be assassins before, and in his own mind destiny was a friend that walked beside him. The signs grew heavier. A soothsayer warned him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia was troubled by dark dreams and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. Cleopatra's own priests, reading the stars, spoke of shadows falling across the eagle's seat. Still, Caesar only laughed. Cowards die many times before their deaths, he is said to have remarked, waving the warnings away. On the morning of the 15th, he entered the theatre built by Pompey, and the irony of the place was lost on no one, for it was beneath the statue of his old rival that his fate was waiting. Surrounded by men he counted as friends, Caesar took his seat, and there the conspirators closed in upon him, more than a score of them together. When at last he caught sight of Brutus among the faces, the man he had loved almost as a son, his resolve is said to have failed him. Et tu, Brute, he is remembered to have murmured before falling at the foot of Pompey's statue. In a single, sudden moment, the most powerful man in Rome was gone, laid low upon the marble floor. Outside, the city shuddered. Word crossed the Tiber quick as drifting smoke. Caesar is dead. Hearing it, Cleopatra shut herself away in her chambers with Caesarion, her thoughts already racing ahead. Love and politics had always been braided tightly together for her, and now both had drawn blood. For Rome, it was the end of a dictator. For Cleopatra, it was the opening of a long and dangerous reckoning. Panic ran through the streets like wildfire. The Senate that had struck Caesar down believed it had rescued the Republic, yet what it had truly loosed was chaos. Crowds gathered demanding vengeance. Soldiers loyal to Caesar's memory stalked the forum chanting his name, and bonfires burned deep into the night, as though the city itself were trying to burn away its own guilt. Amid all the confusion, Cleopatra understood one thing with perfect clarity. Rome was no longer a safe place for her. She had come to the city as the honored guest of the most powerful man in the world, and almost overnight she had become something else entirely, the foreign lover of a murdered ruler, whom his own countrymen blamed for reaching too far. The rumours spread quickly, as rumours do. Some said she had bewitched Caesar. Others insisted her influence had turned his mind toward kingship, and a few even suggested that the daggers had been meant for her as much as for him. Rome, which had once been charmed by her strange elegance, now murmured her name as though it were a curse. Her villa across the Tiber became a house of quiet dread. Servants slipped away in the night. Roman officials found reasons to avoid her door. Messengers arrived with news that contradicted itself from one hour to the next. Caesar's body had been burned in the Forum. His friend Mark Antony had taken command of the army. The conspirators had fled the city. Through it all, Cleopatra waited and calculated, weighing each possibility. She had seen how swiftly affection could curdle into ruin, and Egypt, her Egypt, could not be left unguarded. So one night, beneath a sky with no moon, she made her departure. Her ships had been waiting quietly at Ostia, the port of Rome, and they sailed before the first light. The journey home was tense and hushed, and every creak of the timbers seemed to carry an echo of something remembered. Laughter shared with Caesar. The distant roar of Rome grieving, the small, steady breathing of her child asleep below deck. Caesarion was her last link to the man she had lost, and perhaps also her greatest source of danger. If Rome ever grasped the truth of the boy's parentage, he might become a prize to some and a target to others. When the great lighthouse of Alexandria at last appeared on the horizon, she exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. The city gleamed beneath the Egyptian sun, familiar and full of hidden traps all at once. She had come home a widow of empire, carrying not only a young son, but a legacy stained by Roman blood. In the cool marble halls of her palace, she made a quiet vow. Caesar was gone, but through Caesarion his line and her own ambition would endure. Rome had taken her lover from her, yet it had by no means seen the last of his queen. In the vacuum that Caesar's death had opened, Rome turned once more upon itself. Senators fled, armies changed their allegiance, and the Republic bled through its own streets. Out of that turmoil rose a familiar figure, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and companion. Charismatic, hungry for power, and prone to rash decisions, Antony seized his moment. He addressed the people as Caesar once had, turning their sorrow into anger, and before long he stood as Rome's new strongman, balanced uneasily between the roles of statesman and rabble-rouser. From Alexandria, Cleopatra observed him with careful interest. She knew his reputation well, a man of large appetites, drawn as strongly to pleasure as to power. Where Caesar had been cold and precise, Antony was ruled by feeling. He drank heavily, loved theatrically, and fought as though trying to outrun his own weaknesses. And yet, beneath all that recklessness, Cleopatra recognized something useful. Opportunity. Rome's fragile peace cracked again when Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, rose to challenge Antony's authority. The two men formed an uneasy partnership, each claiming to defend the Republic while quietly plotting its end. In this delicate dance of ambition, Egypt again became essential. Antony needed ships, money, and grain, and Cleopatra possessed all three, along with a shrewd understanding of how to bring a Roman to his knees. In the year 41 BCE, Antony summoned her to Tarsus to answer charges that she had aided Rome's enemies during the recent wars. Most rulers, called to such a reckoning, would have arrived trembling. Cleopatra arrived as a goddess. Her golden barge came up the Cydnus River with purple sails swelling in the breeze and silver oars flashing in the light. Incense drifted across the water, and attendants dressed as small winged spirits fanned her throne. Waiting on the shore, Antony found himself watching a legend take shape before his eyes. When Cleopatra stepped onto the land, she did not bow. She greeted Antony as an equal, in a gesture that was as much theatre as it was diplomacy. Within days, he was thoroughly captivated. A meeting that was meant to be an interrogation had become instead a celebration of desire. Cleopatra knew precisely what she was doing. She had exchanged one Roman general for another, but this time she intended to set the terms herself. As Antony followed her back to Alexandria, the old pattern of history repeated once more. An empire bending toward the will of a woman who governed not with beauty alone, but with a strategy keener than any blade in Rome. When Mark Antony entered Alexandria at her side, the moment carried an echo of the past. Another Roman swept up in Egypt's enchantment. But Cleopatra was no longer the young queen fighting merely to survive. She was now a seasoned ruler, sharper and wiser, and fully aware of what was at stake. With Caesar dead and Rome divided between Antony and Octavian, she saw a chance not simply to protect Egypt, but to shape the wider world again. Their alliance soon deepened, and passion and politics wound tightly together. Cleopatra received Antony with dazzling banquets, tables heaped with gold, wine that seemed to flow without end, and entertainment designed to remind him that Egypt could offer what Rome never could: grandeur without limit. They gave themselves a playful name, the Society of Inimitable Livers, two people who lived as freely as gods. Yet beneath all the laughter, the stakes remained deadly serious. Cleopatra needed a protector, and Antony needed her wealth to fund his planned campaign against Parthia. Each pretended it was love. Each understood, privately, that it was power. In the years that followed, she bore him 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. To her own people, she remained the goddess Isis made flesh. To the Romans, she was, once again, the dangerous enchantress who had led another of their heroes astray. The Senate seethed when Antony granted eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children. Rome saw treachery. Antony saw destiny, an empire reborn and ruled from Alexandria rather than from the banks of the Tiber. But the old story of Caesar and Cleopatra still lingered, casting its shadow over them both. Octavian understood exactly how to turn that story into a weapon. He portrayed Antony as a man enslaved by a foreign queen, and he declared that Cleopatra meant to make Rome itself her servant. It was a distortion, but a useful one. The image of a proud Roman general kneeling before an Egyptian temptress was enough to set the fires of war alight. When the final reckoning came, at the Battle of Actium, it would undo them both. But that is a tale for another time, one that ends in both sorrow and lasting fame. For now, as the sun sank over the Nile, Cleopatra stood upon her palace balcony, her children sleeping and Antony laughing somewhere below. She had loved 2 Romans and would outlive both of them in memory. Their empires would one day fade, yet her legend, the Queen of Kings, the woman who had captured Rome itself, would never truly die. In ancient Egypt, death was not regarded as an ending. It was the doorway into eternity. Life upon the earth was seen as a brief trial, a short rehearsal before the great journey to the world beyond. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, the soul, which they called the Ka, departed from the body, yet still required a physical form to which it might return. Without careful preservation, the car would drift without purpose, lost somewhere between the worlds. And so one of humanity's most remarkable rituals was born: mummification, a sacred craft that turned the dead into something close to divine. The moment death was declared, a countdown of 70 days began. The family called upon a team of specially trained priests, known as the servants of Anubis. These men were no ordinary undertakers. They were keepers of cosmic order, performing rites that had been refined over thousands of years. Before they ever touched the body, they purified themselves, washing in sacred water, burning incense, and reciting hymns to Anubis, the jackal-headed god who watched over embalming. The name of the deceased was spoken softly over the body, meant to reawaken its spiritual recognition. From this point on, every movement carried meaning. Nothing was left to chance. The priests worked in near silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of their chants. The workshop, known as the wabet, was heavy with the scent of resins and natron salts. A painted image of Anubis stood close by, its gaze fixed upon the work, as though it were guarding against any error. The embalmer began by laying the body upon a slanted stone table and washing it with palm wine and water drawn from the Nile. This was both a physical and a spiritual cleansing, for the river's waters stood for renewal and rebirth. Offerings of bread, beer, and perfume were set near the head of the deceased to nourish the spirit through the long change that lay ahead. The organs, once carefully removed, were never simply discarded. Each was placed within a beautifully carved canopic jar, and each jar was watched over by one of the 4 sons of Horus, the guardians of the organs in the afterlife. The jackal-headed Duamutef protected the stomach. The falcon-headed Kabesanuef guarded the intestines. Harpy, crowned with the head of a baboon, watched over the lungs, and Imseti, bearing a human face, kept the liver. These jars were set beside the coffin as faithful companions for the journey. Once the cavity had been emptied, the priests cleansed it again with fragrant resins and filled it with bundles of clean linen, sawdust and spices, cinnamon, cassia and myrrh to restore the body's shape and scent. Then it was carefully closed, the seam hidden beneath wax and resin. In that quiet chamber, the priests had done more than tend to flesh. They had reshaped the human form into a vessel worthy of eternity. With the organs set aside and the body cleansed, the next stage of the journey could begin: the drying. This was the longest and most vital phase of all, lasting a full 40 days. Its purpose was simple, yet sacred: to draw out every trace of moisture, every last sign of mortality. To the Egyptians, decay was a kind of chaos, and chaos had no place in the ordered world of eternity. The priests carried the body to a slanted table within a cool, dry chamber, and there they surrounded it with natron, a natural salt gathered from the desert lakes of Egypt. This mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate was regarded as a gift from the gods, able to draw out the corrupting forces of the earth. The body was buried completely within it, covered from head to foot like a seed pressed into sacred sand. Days lengthened into weeks. The dry desert air worked in quiet partnership with the natron, slowly drawing the moisture from flesh and bone. Inside the chamber the stillness was complete. No prayers, no movement, only time performing its unseen labor. Now and then the priests returned to inspect the progress, offering incense and chanting to Anubis, giving thanks for his protection during the transformation. Outside, the family kept their 40-day vigil, bringing offerings of bread, beer, oils and flowers to secure the soul's peace in this in-between state. The deceased was thought to hover between the worlds, neither living nor gone, held within a sacred preparation. When at last the time came to lift the body from its bed of salt, what emerged was astonishing. The flesh had darkened and grown taut, the features preserved with uncanny precision. Fingers, lips, even eyelashes often remained intact, a human form held motionless in time. The priests gently brushed away the last of the natron and washed the body once more in fragrant oils, coaxing a softness back into the skin. This was the first true glimpse of eternity. The one who lay upon the table no longer belonged to the world of the living, but to the realm of the gods. The priests anointed the body with sacred resins, sealing it against decay and perfuming it for its journey among the stars. 40 days had passed, and with them, in Egyptian belief, so had mortality itself. The body, once frail and fleeting, had been refined into something enduring, the eternal vessel of the soul, hardened and purified, ready to receive divine life once more. With the cleansing finished, the work of restoration began. The quiet labour of priests devoted to Anubis, who now gathered the body back into a single dignified whole and made it ready to be known and welcomed by the gods. The embalmers stood around the long table, their fingers glistening with fragrant oils drawn from cedar and myrrh, from frankincense and the blossom of the lotus. No oil was chosen at random. Some were meant to soften the skin so it would not crack, others to turn back the slow work of decay, and every one of them carried a meaning beyond its scent. As their hands moved along the limbs, the priests murmured old invocations to Osiris, ruler of the dead, and to Hathor, the goddess linked with beauty, joy, and renewal. In their minds, the body was not simply being kept from ruin, it was being coaxed back toward life. Each finger and each toe was bound on its own in fine linen soaked in warm resin, and with every wrapping the priests spoke the name of the one who had died. To an Egyptian, a name was not a small thing. To keep the name intact was to keep the person intact, and so no part of that identity could be allowed to slip away. Between the layers of cloth they tucked small amulets, charms shaped from gold, from bright faience, and from deep blue lapis lazuli. The scarab stood for the renewal of life, the eye of Horus offered healing, and the ankh promised resurrection. Most important of all was the heart amulet, carved in the form of a sacred beetle and set with care over the breast. It was believed to guard the heart during the great weighing of the soul in the hall of Ma'at. Should the heart, in that solemn moment, be tempted to confess the failings of its owner, the amulet would gently quiet it so that the spirit might still find safe passage into peace. Next, the priests filled the hollow of the body with resins and with linen steeped in perfume, restoring its natural shape and its sweetness. The limbs were arranged and the mouth was drawn a little open, a small gesture that carried a large idea that the soul might one day breathe once more. Then the chief embalmer, his face hidden behind the mask of Anubis, pressed a bronze instrument to the forehead and pronounced the words known as the ritual of transformation. By the time the anointing was done, the figure on the table no longer seemed merely human. The scent of oils hung in the chamber, like incense that had drifted down from the heavens. For the priests, this was the moment of rebirth, when the soul might return to a temple made pure again. What had been mortal was now something enduring, a body fit to be spoken of as the dwelling place of a god. Of all the stages, the wrapping was the most sacred and the most heavily laden with meaning, the ritual that carried the body from mortal shell toward eternal being. The priests treated it as both worship and craft, working with a steady, rhythmic care and reciting prayers older than the pyramids that would one day rise above them. The body, now cleansed and anointed, was laid upon a long wooden board. Strips of linen, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters, were made ready from the finest flax the land could offer. Each bandage was purified with incense and oil before it was allowed to touch the skin. The whole process might last 15 full days, and the length was not a matter of slowness, but of reverence. Every layer stood for a spell, and every knot for a prayer. The wrapping opened, as the anointing had, with the fingers and the toes, each one sealed apart so that the physical shape of the person would be preserved. Then came the hands and feet, and after them the arms and legs. Through every turn of the cloth the priest spoke the deceased's name, so that the spirit would always remember who it had been. As the wrappings thickened, more amulets were slipped between the folds, laid over the heart, the throat, and the abdomen, each set against a particular danger waiting in the world to come. At the chest they placed a large scarab amulet, engraved with verses from the Book of the Dead. Its task was solemn and precise, to still the heart during judgment, so that no burden of guilt could rise up and condemn the soul. Over the throat they arranged a jed pillar, the emblem of Osiris, a sign of steadiness and of rising again. Every placement obeyed an unseen order, a map of eternity stitched patiently into linen. Once the trunk and the limbs were sealed, the head was given its own careful attention. The face was wrapped softly, layer folding over layer, until the features lay smooth and calm beneath the cloth. Resin was brushed across the surface to harden the bindings and draw them together into one unbroken form. The last bandages were laid in fine diamond patterns, shaping the familiar silhouette of the Egyptian mummy. Over the face went a mask of gold, or for those of humbler standing a covering of painted cartonnage, showing the divine likeness the deceased would carry forever. When the priests at last stepped back, the human being seemed to have vanished, and in its place lay a still and radiant figure, quiet and complete. The wrapping was finished, yet the spirit's journey had scarcely begun. The body now waited to be awakened by the sacred opening of the mouth, the final step before it could be reborn. For all its perfection, the wrapped mummy remained lifeless, a holy vessel still waiting to be stirred into motion. To the Egyptians, preservation without reawakening meant nothing at all. The opening of the mouth was therefore the most profound rite in the whole undertaking, the moment that restored the senses of the dead and knit body and soul back together. Only once this ceremony was performed could the spirit eat, speak, see, and breathe in the life beyond. At dawn the priests assembled before the wrapped body, which now stood upright or lay within a decorated coffin. The chief officiant, again wearing the mask of Anubis, held a sacred tool called the peshkef. Shaped like a small blade or chisel, it echoed an instrument used at the moment of birth, and so it stood for a second birth, an entrance into eternity. Incense thickened the air, the smoke of myrrh and frankincense mingling with hymns to Osiris and to Horus. Offerings of bread, beer, and milk were set out before the mummy to stand for the nourishment of life. The priests scattered holy water and drew circles in the sand, marking the borders between one world and the next. Then came the rite itself. The peshkef was touched to the mouth, the eyes, the ears, and the nose of the mummy, and each touch carried its own declaration. May your mouth open to speak the words of truth. May your eyes open to see the light of Ra. May your nostrils open to breathe the air of life. The body, so long silent and sealed, was symbolically restored. In that instant, the mummy was no longer a mere object, but a person once more, ready to step into eternity as an immortal being. The ritual closed with an offering of food and drink, which the newly wakened spirit was thought to receive on a level unseen by living eyes. To the Egyptians, this was not a figure of speech. It was, to them, entirely real. The opening of the mouth turned death into continuation, silence into voice, and the stillness of stone back into life. It was at once a farewell and a promise that the soul would endure and would speak its own name before the gods. And in Egypt, to speak one's name was to live without end. With the mouth opened, the body had been reborn, and yet one final step remained before the road to the afterlife could truly begin. That step was the burial, a ceremony both grand and grave. For the Egyptians, this was never simply the setting aside of remains. It was the sacred handing over of a soul into eternity. The procession set out at sunrise. Priests, mourners, and family walked across the desert toward the tomb, bearing the mummy in its gilded coffin. That coffin was itself an act of devotion, painted with hieroglyphic spells, adorned with protective gods, and set in line with the stars. Across its surface every symbol whispered of rising again, the sheltering wings of Isis, the watchful eye of Horus, the looped ankh that stood for life itself. Musicians played mournful flutes while women, often hired for the task, raised their voices in lament, their cries meant to echo the grief of Isis weeping for her husband Osiris. At the tomb, the priests paused to carry out the last purifications. The coffin was lowered to the ground as incense burned, and water drawn from the Nile was sprinkled in blessing. Offerings of bread, beer, onions, and wine were presented to sustain the soul on its long passage, and each gift was accompanied by a recited verse from the Book of the Dead, so that no hunger, thirst, or harm might trouble the spirit in the world to come. Within the tomb, the burial chamber waited, its walls bright with scenes of paradise, the soul sailing beside Ra across the sky, hunting through green fields, and greeting ancestors long since gone. The canopic jars were set beside the coffin, together with amulets, statues, and cherished belongings, everything from combs to jewelry to writing palettes. Even small servants of carved clay, the ushabti, were placed there to labour for the deceased throughout eternity, and each little figure was inscribed with a spell so that it would answer and step forward whenever its owner was summoned to work in the fields of the world beyond. As the final act, the coffin was gently settled into the stone sarcophagus. The priests sealed the chamber and spoke the words, "May your soul live forever in the field of reeds." The field of reeds was the Egyptians' name for a perfected mirror of their own green land beside the Nile, a place where the grain grew tall and the blessed dead lived on in peace and plenty. The mourners turned away, leaving offerings at the entrance as the tomb was closed against the ages. When quiet returned to the desert, only the wind remained, carrying prayers out across the sands, while deep inside the tomb the preserved body rested in stillness, awaiting its next awakening beneath the eternal sun of Ra. For an Egyptian, death was never an ending. It was the opening of the soul's greatest journey. Once the tomb was sealed, the Ka, the vital life force, and the Ba, the personality or spirit, began their passage through the hidden world. Guided by the spells written on the tomb walls and on scrolls of papyrus, the deceased entered the Duat, the vast and shadowed realm of the afterlife. The journey was full of peril. The Ba, often shown as a bird with a human head, had to make its way through caverns of serpents, lakes of fire, and watchful guardians who demanded secret names and passwords. Each trial mirrored a moral truth, a reflection of how the person had lived, for the heart still resting within the wrapped chest was thought to remember every deed, the noble and the shameful alike. There, before 42 gods, the deceased was thought to stand and speak, addressing each in turn and declaring innocence of one wrong after another, a recitation later remembered as the negative confessions. Then Anubis set the heart upon a golden scale and weighed it against the feather of Ma'at, the emblem of truth and cosmic balance. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded what the scale revealed. If the heart proved light, it showed a life lived with integrity. If it hung heavy with wrongdoing, it was given over to Amit, the devourer, a creature drawn from lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus, and the soul's journey would quietly come to its end. For those who passed the test, Osiris himself, the risen lord of the underworld, offered his welcome. "You are justified," he declared. The soul was then transformed into an Ach, a perfected spirit of light. Released from the trials of mortal life, it sailed across the heavens with the sun god Ra, keeping watch over dawn and dusk forever. In Egyptian belief, this was the truest victory of all, not to escape death, but to master it. The preserved body in the tomb allowed the Ka to return whenever it wished, to rest in comfort among the food, drink, and incense left behind by loving family, while the soul wandered freely between the earth and the sky. Through ritual, through prayer, and through patient craftsmanship, the Egyptians had turned dying into something like an art, the art of becoming eternal. To them, immortality was never merely a hope. It was a skill, learned and refined layer by sacred layer beneath the burning sun of Egypt.